Greetings and welcome to Edgy Ideas, the podcast that explores what it means to live a good life and to create the good society in our disruptive age. My name is Simon Western and I will be talking to invited guests about diverse topics, exploring social conscious and unconscious dynamics and desires. A very warm welcome to this edition of Edgy Ideas podcast. Today I have a very special guest, Pooja Sachdev. Pooja is a business psychologist, organizational consultant and founder of Rewire Consulting. Pooja co-authored Rewire, a radical approach to tackling diversity and difference. And the FD described this as the most refreshing approach to diversity they had ever read. This was co-authored with Chris Yates. Prior to setting up her own practice, she worked in the Commission for Racial Equality in the UK and took up roles in large corporations as an OD and diversity and inclusion consultant. She now lives in London with her two daughters. Pooja, you are very welcome to Edgy Ideas.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here.
Delighted. Let's tell our audience a little bit about yourself, Pooja.
So, Simon, you know me very well, so you heard this before. I grew up in India, in Mumbai. I moved out of India when I was a teenager and went to live in America and study in America. I spent 4 years in Wisconsin. And then I moved to London in 1999 after I graduated. So I've been living here ever since. I see myself as a Indian-British-Londoner global person. And I've been working in sort of diversity and inclusion for the last 15, 20 years or so. But by training, I'm an organizational psychologist and a counselor.
That's great. Good. So you're a hyphenated person.
Yes, I'm a hyphenated, ever-growing length of kind of hyphens in there. But yeah, hyphenated person.
I think we all are hyphenated if we kind of look deeply enough. It's just more obvious for some. So today we're going to talk about diversity and inclusion. And you and I have kind of worked together in this field for a long time. And it's a very challenging field. So what have you seen over that time? What challenges do you see presenting themselves over the period you've been working in diversity and inclusion, Pooja?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a challenging field, isn't it, Simon? It's kind of one of those things where you're always fighting the norm. You're always kind of trying to speak, say something countercultural or counter-normative and challenge the way people think. And sometimes it feels like, and my mom said this to me when I was very young, why do you always choose the more difficult path? But it feels like pushing a rock uphill when there are downhill paths, But over the years, I suppose there have been a lot of changes. And I think the biggest change is terminology, whereas kind of in the old days when I used to work at the Commission for Racial Equality and even back in college when we were writing about diversity and inclusion, we didn't really say diversity and inclusion. It was all about equality and equal opportunities. Right. And then we moved to diversity and now to kind of inclusion and belonging. So we're using all these different words, but ultimately it's, we only talk about diversity because it's a kind of an indicator of equality, right? And it's kind of a symptom. It's the way we kind of can measure equality. But sometimes we get stuck on diversity for diversity. So that's why I think now this big shift that's come from George Floyd and the kind of reawakening or the kind of mass mobilization on the issue of race and Black Lives Matter, I think it's almost in a way going back to what we didn't finish addressing, which was ultimately about equality and social justice.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, in psychoanalysis, we have this idea of a return of the repressed. And to me, that racism and inequality and oppression is so often repressed, and it just keeps on revisiting us in different ways. And this latest outburst around Black Lives Matter has really brought it to the fore again, hasn't it?
Yeah, it definitely has. It's definitely a lot more visible. And I think we're in this strange context at the moment, being locked in our homes, with being kind of, having this kind of fear of the virus and, and the power of social media. I mean, it's just forcing people to look at it. You can't escape it. It's not like you can go down to the pub and just hang out with friends and talk about other things. And there's no kind of comfort, in it. So we're forced to look at it. But I mean, the other side of it is there's, with social media, there's that whole kind of bandwagon effect, isn't there? Where you can it's very easy to post something and post a big statement. And so we see a lot of that. I don't want to be skeptical, but it's not as if we didn't know these issues existed, and I know it's for some people, it's a genuine awakening or reawakening. But I'm also skeptical that a lot of it is, a lot of the stuff we see around, kind of especially on social media, is diversity for show, and kind of for organizations, it's kind of almost a PR thing to be seen to be doing the right thing, right?
Yeah, let's talk about kind of the impact and the challenges in organizations, because I agree with you. I mean, I get really troubled by this. Society has many, many challenges, and Black Lives Matter it was specifically American, and then kind of a woke racism and issues across the world in different countries, how they play out in particular ways. But organizations that have a real problem with this, because part of it is very performative. They do kind of they like the rhetoric, and they like the kind of the slogans, and often there's still huge problems going on beneath the surface. So tell me about kind of your experience of working in organizations and the particular challenges you see there.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. A lot of it is performative, and a lot of it is, you won't believe the amount of time and effort and money that's spent on getting the words right, it's such an obsession. And I know it's important. Language is important. But sometimes the intention isn't about, the meaning of language. The intention is about not getting backlash, and not kind of getting blamed for saying the wrong thing. Organizations, it's calmed down a little bit now, but back in August, organizations were in crisis mode. And like almost kind of a sense of panic, pushing people to do kind of Band-Aid type things, like, put out this big statement on social media, or make a large donation, or quickly appoint a new diversity lead. And I'm not saying that there isn't genuine intention somewhere underneath that, because I've seen that as well. I've seen people genuinely want to create change, but a lot of it, and you worry about these kind of knee-jerk reactions, because it feels like it's coming from a place of defensiveness and kind of almost deflecting it. So I'll appoint this new D&I head, and they'll take away this problem for me, Yeah. It's almost like they'll take on the conscience of the whole organization on their shoulders, and then I can kind of go back to doing what I was doing before, instead of actually like, let's all pause and look at this issue and look at the boring stuff, which is around our little practices and norms and power and culture, the stuff that matter. Yeah.
Boring, but probably the real important stuff, the nitty gritty of it. I mean, I agree with you. Sometimes walking through a corporate, you can feel like it reminds me of being in the kind of the Soviet Union when you see these slogans everywhere, and corporates have this kind of sloganeering way of dealing with stuff. Like if you put it on the website, if you paste up enough slogans on the walls about diversity and inclusion, or about equality, or about hope, or about whatever, this positive kind of thinking, it's as if that's enough. And then beneath the surface, there's often a toxic culture and stuff going on, which is just not being addressed.
Yeah, exactly. And then the danger is people kind of learn that language because it's plastered everywhere, it's all over. And so they learn the right terminology, because that's not hard. It's not, so you learn that, and then you carry on as normal. So it's like the old, when we often talk about kind of old racism and new racism and modern racism, is the stuff you can't actually see. So old racism was like, when I first moved to this country, people would just call you Paki in the street. And, I kind of got, received very obvious racism like that on a couple of occasions, which, it was horrible. I'm not kind of minimizing that. But at the same time, you knew where you stood, and you can kind of say, that's bad. This is that person's problem, not mine. Whereas now, the stuff is so subtle because people are saying all the right things, but you don't really know what they really think or feel. And that, in a way, we've created an environment in which they're not free to say what they really think and feel. So it kind of goes underneath somewhere. And if you look at the stats socially, obviously, we know we still have a problem, but it's just harder to put your finger on.
Yeah, I think language is one of the biggest problems. I've written, as you know, on political correctness and how it stifles language. And if you're part of a progressive elite, you learn the latest kind of terminology, and you can go to the diversity inclusion classes and you know your stuff. For many people, it's very frightening, and it just silences people. I know so many kind of people who are just silenced by the conversations, and they attend workshops and diversity workshops, and they just can't express anything because they become stutterers. They become afraid to speak. And even me carrying kind of a white body, a white male body into a room when we're talking about these issues, you kind of you come with a burden of guilt and kind of shame from the beginning, and it's like, what can I say, what can't I say, and would I say the wrong thing? And it actually stops people having open conversations about what's really going on.
I totally agree. And it's not just you. It's not kind of just a white man's burden. I mean, I carry that into every session that I do as well. And, I do diversity and inclusion for a living. And still, I'm kind of constantly worried about using the wrong phrase, because I know it doesn't come from a bad intention, but I know the impact of, especially now, I think where people are, it's almost like I don't want to kind of minimize the word woke, but it's being so overused that everything in diversity and inclusion become like a wokeness competition. Like I get 1 point over you if I can point out that the phrase that you used, like just earlier you used the phrase nitty gritty. I used that in a session a couple of years ago, and it's a phrase that we just have in our language, right? But it does have roots in slavery, and that was pointed out to me. And it's fine that it's pointed out to you in a room, and I kind of correct it. You don't use it, and you educate yourself, and you move on. But there was something in that dynamic of pointing it out, like the power the other person felt over me in that environment. So it's not just you. I mean, I walk around being extra careful with the words that I use, and I think everyone does.
Yeah, I know it's not just me, and I'm ashamed of being called out on this podcast for being a racist.
See, it's so easily done. That time has really stayed with me as well, because it was in a training session where I was already kind of at the front of the room feeling self-conscious, and I just remember the dynamic shift at that point when it happened, and almost derailed the purpose of why we were there to some extent. Yeah.
I mean, it's quite interesting. I mean, being a student of the unconscious, I mean, when you said nitty gritty was derived from kind of slavery and stuff, I now have a vague recollection that I knew that. And it's interesting that when you're on these conversations, your unconscious kind of does kind of throw up these things, and they're surfaced. It's an interesting process.
Yeah.
One thing I'm interested in as well is this. There also seems to be like a power play around the hierarchy of diversity, kind of what's most important at any given time. So is it the LGBT plus? Is it kind of Black Lives Matter? Is it, and they seem to exchange. Is it gender? What's your experience of that?
Yeah, I mean, we play around with it. I mean, it feels like from an organizational point of view, the focus has been heavily on gender, and I really don't believe that's because people think gender is more important. I just think gender is easier in a way, because we have the data there. There's, gender cuts across a lot of the other categories. Globally, we can kind of relate with gender issues. So it's one that's kind of, you don't have to sell in so much, and so it's easier. And that's why it's kind of just gone to the top, because it's easier to set targets and do things like that. And there is a sense that the other strands of diversity, if you want to call them that, have taken a back seat. And it's not just race. It feels like race is one of those. One, I think, probably the most awkward to talk about, because people do clam up. It's in a way, even though, like, for example, disability hasn't been at the top of priorities for organizations. You can have, I think, you can kind of quite easily bring up the topic of disability with somebody else, whereas bringing up the topic of race has always been thorny and awkward.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, I was, when I began to read about intersectionality, that really spoke volumes to me. That became very helpful to me as well. It's how these things aren't, you can't just kind of put a boundary around gender, and, the struggles within feminism. There was Black feminists, and there was kind of sexuality and gay feminists and these split-offs and these struggles and stuff. But I think intersectionality is a really kind of important kind of part of this dialogue.
Yeah, I agree. You can't really talk about race in isolation, right? It doesn't make sense, because I'm brown, I'm female, but I'm a lot of other things as well. And it's about how these things interact. But I don't know, I don't know if you agree, but it feels sometimes that we go in circles with this, because we had, for example, in the UK, we had, I used to work at the Commission for Racial Equality, which was obviously focused on race, and, similar organizations were set up for looking at, gender, for example, Equal Opportunities Commission and the Disability Rights Commission. We had these separate bodies, and they were ultimately pulled together into the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which is, an overall kind of equality body. So we were kind of heading in that direction and kind of looking at intersectionality and thinking about inclusion in general. And now it's almost like we've gone back a little bit and said, no, hang on a minute. You haven't. Like, by doing that, you've forgotten about the unique challenges that we have with racial inequality.
Yeah.
I don't know. And I don't know what the answer is. Like, I don't know if there's a right way, but it almost feels like we're seesawing between those positions all the time.
Yeah. And I think that's a reality of it. I mean, I think there always is like plural challenges and multiple tensions. And it's how do you address it? And I mean, let's think about how we actually work with this in organizations, because I'll be honest with you, Pooja, I've not been that impressed with a lot of the diversity inclusion work I've come across in the big corporations. I mean, what do you think works or doesn't work, or kind of how do you think this should be approached in organizations?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the approach that, this is my point of view, the approach that I found that doesn't work is creating these artificial binaries that we have now. So right now, when you talk to organizations, talk to leaders and people in organizations, we're not saying it, but we seem to be dividing people into kind of like the good social justice warriors.
Yeah.
And the kind of the bad, not woke, racist, everybody else, right? And it's very artificial, because it's not exactly like that. Like D&I, social justice educators like myself, make mistakes and are not completely woke. Whereas it's, if like this, I mean, I get the idea of, if you're not, the idea of it's important to be anti-racist, not just not racist. Like, I get that. You need to be putting that effort in to change, to shift the norm, right? I get that. But in real life, when you call somebody a racist, or when you put somebody in that position of guilt and fear and shame, I don't believe that actually creates positive change. So you're pushing people into the position of like the guilty racist.
Yeah.
And they react in a panic, and they learn the language, and they either become over vocal on the other side, or they go into their shell and they just don't say anything because they're scared of getting it wrong. So we're putting people on the defensive with this approach, and it's not. I mean, I feel like it's backfiring. And for those people on like kind of, if you want to see it as two sides, which it seems to be at the moment. So if you're on this side of it, if you're kind of on the social justice D&I kind of side of it, it becomes exhausting as well.
Yeah, sure.
It's like you have to take on the all the kind of the conscience and the good work, and it's all on you, and you're fighting everybody else who's just not getting it. And I think that binary is just, I think ultimately it's going to backfire. People are not going to reform. They're just going to learn how to perform, really.
Well, they learned how to perform, or they learned how to rebel. I mean, the Trump support, the kind of the white support for Trump is part of this. I think, that there's this sort of left behind group of post-industrial kind of workers who in the Rust Belt, and then they see kind of progressives and the liberal elites, as they call it, and pushing these agendas, and it just alienates them, I think. And it's how do we engage people right across the board from all different backgrounds? And I mean, one of the I think a phrase you used is to decriminalise bias. Is that right?
Yeah.
I share that quite a lot with people. I found that a very important kind of phrase. Do you want to say a bit about that?
Yeah, it's a very important one to me, because it's, I feel like the only way you'll kind of start talking about it and have those difficult conversations and get past that defensiveness is if you take away the kind of the criminalization that we've attached to bias, because we know that, we're all human beings and we're all biased and we all have prejudice, whether you like it or not, we do. So in order to shift it, you have to be able to remove that huge value judgment that you've got attached to it and decriminalize it. So we can then kind of say, okay, this is a mistake. How do I course correct? How do I, fix this lens that I'm looking at the world through? try to look at it from somebody else's lens. And it's all kind of little practice. It's almost like metacognition, like taking that observer stance on yourself and non-judgmentally and with compassion, looking at yourself and your reactions and fixing where fixing is needed, without this huge weight of, the ER word or, bias being seen as something I have to cover up or shy away from.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely vital. If we want to do the real work, we can do the surface work and we can do pretend work. We can get people to kind of learn the right language. But if we really want to kind of challenge the structural kind of systems which are kind of repeat the racism and repeat kind of gender bias, we have to kind of allow people to kind of speak and to explore their own bias. If you can't explore your biases, then the work's not being done, is it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think become almost debilitated with kind of shame and guilt. So we kind of shove it underneath. Like, I don't want anyone to know what my biases are. I don't want to, talk about it openly. So we get nowhere. It's a bit this, it's the same pattern as organizations where they're making those big statements on social media, but everything underneath remains the same. It kind of becomes the same for an individual.
So unconscious bias is interesting. When I was a counselor, I was trained in Rogerian counseling approaches, and they talked about being non-judgmental. And it always kind of struck me as being a bit odd because, as I said to my tutors, we all make judgments all the time. The minute we see somebody, we make a judgment, and some of it's conscious and some of it's unconscious. So there's this kind of idea that we can all be utopian and equality can be everywhere. That's not how it goes. It's different nations, different body shapes, different ways of speaking, working class accents, all these things are at play all the time, and we're constantly making judgments, and there's constantly bias in there. And the point is to kind of explore that and be aware of it and make sure that that's not toxic, make sure that doesn't kind of deny people access to jobs and to roles. But it's really doing that work, isn't it? And not trying to deny it and brush that under the carpet.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And so, you read these, these critiques of unconscious bias training, and sometimes they're so scathing. They just kind of say unconscious bias training does not work. And a lot of them, are just touching the surface. So they don't work because all you're doing is telling people that everybody is biased. And there you go, now you're aware, as if just by telling people that you're going to somehow address these deeply rooted belief systems that we all have that actually make us human, that, we cannot live without in a way. That's just how our brain works. I remember studying Carl Rogers and having the same reaction, Simon, because, his concept of unconditional positive regard. I sometimes talk about that in like diversity training almost, you have to start from that position and then you can have those difficult conversations with somebody who has a completely different point of view. But actually, it's almost unachievable, isn't it? I've had years of counseling training and I don't, I really, if I'm honest with myself, don't feel like I've got to that point of unconditional positive regard, because as you said, we walk around with these judgments all the time. So I don't know. I don't feel like there's a magic wand solution with unconscious bias. I just feel like it's it's about choosing to walk around with your eyes open. So to be aware that they're at play and kind of try to surface, try to bring them to your conscious awareness, or when they're brought to your conscious awareness, to be able to take that observer stance and look at them and try to move it out of the way. I mean, ultimately, you're not going to get rid of bias, right? And somebody said to me the other day, if it's unconscious, how am I supposed to, get rid of it? I'm not aware of it. So how can I get rid of it? But I think it's just a kind of choosing a lifelong way of thinking and a way of being, which is self-examining and, self-critical in that way.
Yeah. And Freud said from where it was, ego shall be. So it's really about kind of making as much of that unconscious stuff which gets acted out in the workplace, making it conscious. So where our unconscious is, our conscious should be. And the more conscious we are of our stereotyping of others, the more conscious we are of our biases, the more we can negotiate them and manage them and work with them, rather than kind of them coming out in toxic ways and playing out in ways where we're not in control of what we're doing.
Yeah. I mean, what's your experience been, Simon, of working with, as a white male in this context that we're in, and, being so aware of the conscious and unconscious? And I know you read a lot on the subject, but what's your take or experience with this?
Well, it's just a bit about my history. I got brought up in Bristol, and Bristol was a slave, a city built on slave money. Quite simple. And it was, and I grew up in. It's interesting. I think there's a TV program, Small Acts, by Steve McQueen, is on at the moment, and he's talking about the kind of the black riots in the late 70s and the 80s. And when I was in Bristol, there was black riots going on. People were burning the city. It was really a time of kind of intense racial disharmony.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I went to a school which was like 95% white, and we were racist. It's like, racism was part of the common language in those times. It was culturally kind of normative to be racist. And, we didn't approach race with kind of a toxic idea. It was just part of our language, and it was on TV, and it was around us. And then in my later youth and early 20s, I hung out in St. Paul's area of Bristol, where the black communities were. And I was a huge reggae fan, and we used to hang out with the Rastas and go to the concerts and the gigs, and it kind of transformed me, because once you get close to kind of the other people, otherness, it changes your views completely, and opened my eyes. But interestingly, so I've had a very diverse experience. But interestingly, when I'm in the workplace, we carry with us, it's like the social speaks through us, and people see me as a white man with a white body, and people project onto you kind of lots of different stuff.
Yeah,
because I work in the field, I'm very aware of those projections and how they change. So I came from I got thrown out of school at the age of 16, and when I stood up in front of a class in university as a professor, the projection onto me about being a professor were really odd, because I always saw myself as uneducated, and suddenly you're being projected onto the person as the one who is supposed to know the kind of the owner of that. So I'm aware of those projections, and carrying them into the diversity and inclusion work is interesting, because when you go to one of these unconscious bias discussions, and people feel oppressed and they feel ashamed to speak, you go to kind of the men's room afterwards, and you'll get snide remarks from other blokes. They look at you and they think you're one of them because you have the same color. And you're male, and they'll say, like, that was a tosh, wasn't it? That was they use language. So my experience is very much about what you're saying, really, is that there's a lot of guilt, there's a lot of shame, there's still a lot of racism out there. I'm very aware of it, and it's still there. It's not so like you say, we don't use the word packy anymore, and it's not when I was at school we did. But it's hidden, but it's still there, and I just find that the diversity inclusion space makes it very hard to work with, for people with white skin. They don't know how to kind of address the shame, the guilt. There's some people who practice performative. These people really annoy me. They're the woke ones, who kind of perform all the right language and they're very right on with it, and they use it as a power play, and that I find most annoying, because it just silences the other people. So there's a huge amount of work to do, and in some ways, I sometimes wonder whether we should have kind of groups of kind of white men actually having a space to kind of work on some of this stuff themselves before they go to a diversity and inclusion workshop. It almost feels like you need some space where people can actually look at their biases and do some pre-work in a way, because it's still very, the problems are there, and that's my experience, and how we kind of either feel shameful about it, or how we kind of feel very, white fragility is quite a good word, I think, because there is a lot of white fragility out there. That is my experience.
Yeah, and I think from what you're saying, it's the white fragility, yes, and the pre-work, yes, but also the complexity, right? So that, like you said, these kind of assumptions being projected on you because you inhabit a white male body, you'll also carry these beliefs, and you also have assumptions made about, I guess, assumptions made about you as well. But it's not homogenous, it's not binary, it's really not that simple. And I think sometimes. And I don't want to get to the point where we say, oh, it's so intersectional and it's so complex and everybody's individual, we just can't even talk about it anymore. I don't want to get to that point either. But actually, it's a lot more complex than black and white.
It is, there's class, and there's, I've read a lot about bias and just the way it plays out in kind of deprived white areas, the level of education, white males are the kind of highest suicide, they're kind of highest, they're the worst performers in education of all the groups.
Yeah.
And so when people talk about white people as if there's a homogenous white, it's exactly. Is there a homogenous black? There isn't. So how do we kind of work across those different boundaries? And I just spent a lot of time with the traveling community as well. The traveling community, they've just won status in Ireland for being a kind of an ethnic group in the last few years, but to all visibility, they have white skins, but that doesn't mean they're the same as kind of someone who came out of Eton College and runs a country in the UK. A completely different life story. So this stuff is very nuanced, isn't it?
It is nuanced, and I think we have to kind of deal with the complexity without getting overwhelmed by it as well. We have to, the class is an issue, but it doesn't mean that race is not an issue. They're kind of separate, but they intersect as well. So, and I think that's where the challenge with this work is as well. And I think that's where it triggers a lot of defensiveness as well, where people are kind of saying, when you talk about white privilege, it provokes a lot of defensiveness because people are saying, it doesn't mean that I've had an easy life. But of course, it doesn't mean that. It just means that the difficulties that you might have had in your life were not because of race. It might have been because of other things, but it's just not because of race. So it's just trying to get to, and do you separate that stuff out? And then where do you go? Where do you get, if you're in that training room where, like you were saying from your experience of going, when you went to the restroom and then you're just, the real thoughts and feelings come out. Yeah. How do you break through that? And I have often wondered when I've been at the front of a room doing this stuff, if it wouldn't be better done by somebody who just, looked like these people in the room, would they listen more? Would they be a bit more open? Would they talk differently? I mean, I'm not going to ever know that, but it does cross my mind, and actually this is the reason I never wanted to do, I didn't want to do diversity and inclusion. I set out to I was set out to do market research and then marketing and then employee research. And I just wanted to do marketing, I just wanted to do research. I didn't want to do research into diversity and inclusion. I didn't want to do this specifically this line of work. I just wanted to do kind of normal stuff. But you just I kind of got sucked in.
But it is such an important area, and it's a very interesting area, and it's a hugely kind of important area. I mean, one piece of work I did once, and it was with an ongoing group. I was doing coach training at Lancaster University, and I had a group who came back for 6 or 7 modules. So, I mean, that enabled me to build up trust with people, and I did a piece of the diversity there, which stayed with me. We put on people's backs a stereotypical character, a picture of a stereotypical kind of character, and we got people to kind of walk up behind the person and write down immediately the first 6 words came to their mind.
Yeah.
So you didn't have time to kind of cut through the unconscious a bit.
Yeah.
We sat around and we kind of debriefed it, and people were kind of shocked by what came out of their own associations.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was a very powerful exercise, but it was about, I mean, we have to find ways of building up enough safety, enough trust. In psychoanalysis, we talk about creating a containing or a holding environment where that stuff can be explored and people can say, I was really shocked by kind of what came to me, and they're not just kind of putting up defensive, nice words. They were writing the words which really came to them, and they were kind of surprised by kind of what's inside ourselves, and that's a kind of space we have to try and create, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And I think once people are allowed to, or almost kind of given the instruction to like surface those associations, then you can kind of just look at it and deal with it, right? It reminds me of another game. It's not a game, but it's like an icebreaker that I've used in the past, very long time ago in diversity training. I think we called it diversity bingo or something like that. But whereas at the very kind of top of the session, you kind of give people this little sheet and say quickly, like in the next, like you've got 1 minute, whiz around, find somebody who, A, has children, B, has an accent, C, something else like that. And so, and obviously the aha there is that, you quickly look around and you make an assessment about who's more likely to be from another country or have an accent, although, obviously everyone has accents, but, that point aside, we do use these kind of shortcuts and judgments, and these associations do live in our minds. But there's a practice of kind of bringing them into our awareness, which is what we need to develop, rather than kind of putting judgments on it. Just bring them into our awareness and see where we are and what impact that might be having. Yeah.
I mean, we have to kind of open up that curious place where we become curious about ourselves and our biases and our understanding, and it goes so deep. I mean, colonialism and racism goes so deep and is so deeply set within us, and people are now putting down statues because they're becoming aware of cultural kind of culture being in our architecture. When I was in Bristol, my first concert was at the Colston Hall, and the Colston Hall was the place where we saw all the big rock bands and the gigs, and of course Colston was a slave owner, and but we didn't have a clue at the time. But it's there, and it is kind of it does kind of speak through our culture, and we have to become curious about that and understand how that's impacted on us, I think, if we're going to make the changes.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think that also we need to look at it as not that it's detached and individuals don't have any responsibility, but actually these dynamics, these power dynamics based on race, class, and everything else are in and around us, right? They're in the architecture, they're in the systems, they're kind of institutionalized. So they're a little bit external to us as well. So we are part of the system, but we also have to look at it as a problem we have in society rather than me. Like racism is something that is built into our systems and the way we live and make decisions, and it's kind of everybody's job to unpack that and fix it and get to a point of greater or get closer to equality or equity. But it's I think sometimes it's seen as an individual problem. Like racism is you're either you're a racist or you're not, rather than we are all a product of and part of a racist environment.
Yeah, I mean, we're running out of time, but I think it's very interesting that whenever there's the term institutional racism used, it was used against the police at one stage, and it creates an incredible furore. It creates an incredible upset. It really creates a disturbance in the system, and I find that very interesting. Where for me, it's like, of course, there's institutional racism. Like, we're born into kind of a colonial society, and this is going to come through our institutions. This is kind of who we are, and how do we work this stuff. But it really creates a kind of a disturbance in the system, and I think people find it much easier to kind of point individuals out as racist rather than kind of think it's a cultural and institutional kind of problem.
Yeah, exactly. It's the bad apples, right, rather than all of us and the barrel.
Yeah. Pooja, listen, this has been fascinating talking to you. I've got two last questions, and you know what they're going to be. They're about how, with all your experience and your life story, what can you share with our audience around how to live a good life and how to create a good society?
I think based on everything we've said, the one thing that really stood out to me is you use the word curiosity. And I think to position ourselves with curiosity about ourselves and about our societies. And, I think we're always going to have bias. We're always going to have power structures. We're always going to have in-groups and out-groups. So let's position ourselves to be critical, be curious, learn about them, and kind of understand how they impact us and how we kind of, fix things and move towards greater equality without defensiveness and without oversimplified binary thinking. So engage with the search for equality.
That's a great way to end, Pooja. Listen, keep on doing the great work you're doing, and Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts on Edgy Ideas.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Simon.
Following this podcast, Simon and Pooja will be running a webinar on January the 28th, 2021 from 3 to 5 p.m. UK time, entitled Diversity and Inclusion, Are You Performing or Reforming? If you're interested in attending this webinar, please contact Simon at analyticnetwork.com. Thank you for listening to Edgy Ideas. If you enjoyed our podcast and would like more information about our coaching, training and events, please contact Simon at analyticnetwork.com or go to www.analyticnetwork.com. Thank you for listening.